Hello, welcome back. Human Design Book Club. Today we're presenting the Gene Keys Golden Path Love Book by Richard Rudd. And this does also, today we're going to be talking about a little bit about the information that is provided in the Gene Keys Basic Free course. But we're excited to talk about the Venus sequence. We are your hosts, JKR, Jen Cordes is integration generator 3-5 cross of service quad right mountains. Hi Jen.
Hello.
And Kayla Sita, emotional manifester 1-3 cross of service shores. Hi Kayla.
Hello.
Myself, Rebecca Anderson, splenic projector 2-4 cross of Maya quad right mountains. And if you'd like to reach out to us, here are individual ways to reach out. jennifersglass.com, Instagram, Mother of Dane, and Rebecca _living it up. And we also, of course, have our Human Design Book Club Instagram. I believe that's humandesign.bookclub. Find us there if you haven't already. We envision a world where everyone can live their truth. Everyone can make decisions easily. People are safe to tell their story. People get to have fun together. Community supports us while giving us the freedom to explore our individual paths. And we do have a lovely presentation that we're sharing if you're watching us on YouTube. And if you're just listening, feel free to find the presentation. There's links to it, and they'll be on Jen's website at this time. I wish you well as you begin your journey into your Venus sequence. This is the quote. My only advice is to tread softly and to travel, if possible, in company. The Venus sequence thrives on support, on friendship, and above all else, it thrives on love. Aww.
It's very lovely. Mhm.
So, what's interesting about this Gene Keys book is that it's not human design, right? But Richard Rudd was a student of human design and was very deep into it. He even wrote books about it. Then he ended up getting his own revelation, and that is what the Gene Keys are. And so it's, as many people consider it, a sister program to human design. And we have here on the slide just a few comparisons. The Venus sequence itself, Richard Rudd describes as a 3-day heightened state of consciousness while the Venus transited the sun, a flood of insight that created a silent knowing. And it's an emotional journey, not a mental, mechanical one like human design is. And there is a similar journey of requiring observation and surrender. So the Venus book that we read here about love is actually the second book in the sequence of 3. First one's called Activation Sequence. Second one is Venus. And the third one is the Pearl sequence. The first one, Activation, is about your self and purpose in life. The second one, Venus, here is love, as we're discussing, and relationships. And as we'll find, there's also a lot just about your personal upbringing and your journey through actually in the womb all the way up through adulthood. And then the Pearl sequence has to do with your prosperity and material abundance in the world. Go ahead and read one more quote here. Our intention, our unconscious attitude, and our deep sense of purpose all dictate the outer life. And to access the inner fabric of our reality, we must turn within. Contemplation is such a turning inwards. This entire voyage along the golden path affords us an enrichment of our inner life. And the golden path is the whole thing put together. The activation, the pearl, and the Venus. So I myself had been familiar with the Gene Keys, and I had read this book before, including all of them. But Kayla and Jen, this was their first introduction to the gene keys and specifically the pathways. So we're going to talk about what we all thought about this book and how it compares to human design. Kayla, would you like to start with what some of your initial thoughts of the book were?
Sure. Yeah, I thought it was neat, the heavy focus on the lines versus like to really take a deeper dive into that. I remember when I first learned human design, I thought it was really neat to go through each of my gates and what line they're in and what that means for that gate. So that deep contemplation with the line specifically, I thought was really neat. It was it felt kind of how some people say that, like, well, astrology is not real because it's so general. You know, you hear that a lot from people who are skeptics. This book felt really general to where a lot of it didn't resonate, but it was so deep and contemplative that you could almost find truth in all of it. So that was kind of my first reaction. Now, when I found human design, I was skeptical at first too. So I feel like if we do read any more of these books, maybe it will deepen it for me. Because when I did read my general, like when you get your free report, you kind of get some basics. I feel like that resonated pretty well with me. But going through this book, I didn't get any like major ahas about feeling like this was definite truth. But it was kind of a cool read. I really do love Richard Rudd's other human design books. He has one on all of the channels, and that's one of my favorite go-tos. So in general, I do really like him. This book, I feel like I'm kind of like still unsure on.
Great. Jen, how about you?
Well, when you were talking, Kayla, I thought you're a 1-3, you're supposed to start skeptically. I mean, that's actually what Ra would say is if you're trying to do a reading for a 1-3, say, hey, I've got this thing. I really don't know if it's going to work for you. So the moment someone hands you something and says, this is the answer, you're designed to be like, no, thank you. I might have mentioned this to you offline a while ago, but I found it interesting to come up against my own bias that he just got to have up. Here's some enlightenment for you. Whereas Ra really kind of worked. It was a process for him. It was painful. It was difficult. And not only that, but he had been going through cleansing and preparation processes even before his encounter, or with Dr. Yusui in Reiki. That was a 21-day fast up on a mountain, and he despaired because it wasn't until the very end that he was shown the symbols. And I always thought he worked for it. And it was interesting to look at this and think, does this just get to be handed to you? And I thought that was its own kind of maybe belief to look at when I was doing this. Um, I didn't love it, and I think a part of that is not I enjoy listening to him, and I love how he takes the different aspects of the gates with the challenge and the gift and then the beautiful thing. It's beautiful, but I like listening to him, but reading him, I think I'm so used to Ra, where he is so good at describing mechanics. He takes such an esoteric concept and can really boil it down, and he'll go through it multiple times. So even when Ra introduces new terminology, I've read it so much, I feel like I didn't have to quote learn it because I sort of soaked it in. This book felt like I would have liked to have had a book just on his spiritual approach, and then a book that kind of goes through the nuts and bolts. Trying to switch between an abstract and a logical process was giving me a headache. So some of that could just be I wasn't in the mood for him, maybe, but it felt very all over the place. Some parts were beautiful and grounded, and other parts just felt like they were floating around to me. But again, I am so steeped in Ra, it might not be a fair thing to ask me. I wouldn't turn anybody away from it. He has beautiful mindset. But I agree with Kayla. It was so big, I couldn't even begin to boil it down.
Mhm.
And I wondered if the parts that resonated weren't just, you're eventually going to hit something like spray and pray marketing, right? Like eventually something will land. So,
Yeah, I definitely see the bigness of it. And when I first read it last year, I remember just it feeling so dense, like kind of like, yeah, I don't know that I get this for sure.
mhm.
Second time, got it a little bit more, but I guess I approached it with the idea of contemplation, which is a main theme that Richard Rudd talks about as to how to take in his work is to not try to completely understand it logically, but to just take it in and let it work on you. So it's definitely a different approach completely. And I do enjoy it. I definitely do want to learn more about the gene keys and get into how it can work side by side with human design. So, what, but I do also agree that quite a bit of it, I wasn't sure if I resonated, but then some I did.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if he mentioned it in this book or if it was the first book. Let me know if you guys remember this or not. But he was saying, like, read all of the lines because we all have all of them. And then, but the one that we have is the more prominent one. Did you guys take that approach or did you just kind of focus in on the one that was yours?
I did, but that's what made it feel like he was gonna find something that you would agree with.
Yeah.
And I took the opposite approach only because I've been struggling with reading lately. I really did kind of just mine. Um, but it still felt general to me, even though I did see him say multiple times, like everyone is gonna have this theme in their life, but it's gonna be more prominent if it's your specific sequence.
Mhm,
And if we compare that with like Jenna Zoe's book where she was going through the gifts without the lines.
mhm,
And there were parts, 'cause I think Kayla, that was one where you mentioned how some of them seemed sort of general. And I got that, and I began my training with her, so I was more familiar with it. But even when I read hers, I always felt like even if it was a mountaintop view, macro, she was on the essential truth of it. She just might not have gone into details. Here, I wasn't even sure if I was on the right mountain at times.
mhm. There's a few things that are definitely like a stretch, like, where's that coming from?
Yeah.
So, but there are the three parts of the key. So each key, there's 64, they correspond with the gates in human design. And so there's a shadow aspect. This is your challenge to surmount, where the key teaches you. There's the gift aspect, a creative attribute to develop what you learn. And the city is the transcendent realization, what you realize when the gift is mastered. The shadow is for each key, there's a different keyword, keynote, and the gift then comes out of the shadow, which is something that is part of the contemplation. Like, how does that, you transform, you embrace your shadow to transform it into the gift. And then the gift ultimately becomes the city. But the cities are so weird, in my opinion. They are almost all alike, and they are all having to do with once we realize this state beyond humanness almost, then
A
and then
rave.
we're not ourselves anymore. I think that's the part I don't like because then he's like,
No.
"You're not you anymore." I'm like, "But I want to be me. I like me." So, but he does say, the shadow and the gift is where you can really work with these a little bit more. And but in the book we read, they only really kind of touched on shadow and gift slightly. It's a little bit more pronounced when you read the Big Gene Keys book, which describes all the 64 keys.
Yeah, and I do have that big book, and I've read some of it, and I think that was the book that made me more interested in this whole concept because when you read like the Ray V. Ching by Ra, he's very clear that he's describing the not self. So here we have this idea that he's kind of transcended more than just the shadow, but it does sometimes the concept feels too big to like grasp. And that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the difficulty in it versus it being very specific. This is the true self of the skate, and this is the not self of the skate. Like, I feel like that's what I really needed.
And I like that very much because that previous slide, I think that was the part that was from that free course that he puts out. And I think that's a lovely way, even if you don't want to get super deep in this and you just want to take some of these concepts, just to look at the lower vibration and the higher vibration and then pair that with raw. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful way to do it because the cities remind me a lot of what can happen in a rave, to where it's like we may not even be meant to experience that. Like it's so high and it's so big and it requires such a connection with consciousness, right? Like in
That's a good point.
and Ware Penta, basically. Like it's so different. And I always think maybe that's why is he was seeing what would be coming eventually, way down the line. How I like to approach it.
Ooh, when we get to our hologenetic profiles, I'd love for you all to think about maybe what are your favorite gift and cities,
Mm.
if you had any within this. And or maybe your most profound shadow, if you feel drawn to that. Another quote, deep contemplation on the way you behave in your relationships will betray hidden patterns of resistance to your dharma. These teachings are about letting go of your self-image. Where your dharma is concerned, you can only surrender.
That reminds me of Raw.
hmm So what I also found was interesting with this book, I don't want to call it a bait and switch, but that's the word that comes to mind, is like, oh, it's about love. Oh, it's about relationships. But it's really about your core wounds of when you were born and, and our wounds of humanity and wounds from being in the womb, and then our years 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, and beyond. It was really interesting to me how that ended up being what each of these chapters was about. And then it's meant to draw us back to relating it to our relationships. But to me, it wasn't quite all coming together yet on that. What did you guys think about those different pieces of this book?
Yeah, I think he should have retitled it more self-love or how not to trauma bond, basically. It was kind of how it felt to me. It's like, this is how you don't get into a trauma bonding relationship. Yeah, I think it was more about self-love than anything else, because then when you have that, then you have external love. But I don't think this had anything to do really with romantic love at all. It was in general.
Yeah, and I guess it is an interesting look at a different way conditioning can happen because in the human design aspect, even as growing up, it would be like, who were you around and what not self theme was kind of coming out. So it's kind of a different look or different way of looking at it. I don't know if it resonated as much as the general not self and human design. But I could see how, yeah, I agree. It was more about like self-love than relationships.
Yeah, and he did talk about like, use this with your primary relationship, is what he called it. And then also use this with your close people in your life. And then also if you're single, then you would consider how you would just use this personally or with, different people. And so I was wondering if that made any difference to you, whether having a primary relationship or not. Were you thinking about that, having that or not having that during this or not?
Yeah, I was looking back at how I did behave in a primary relationship, and that
Hmm.
part was helpful. Before it went so far down IQ and EQ and SQ, and I'm like, okay, this seems like that needs to be a different book. But even just taking that core pattern of when I begin to get close to someone, basically, how did my conditioning come out? Absolutely. And then I could see going forward outside of a significant relationship, just day to day, or even just being with myself, I could almost take parts of it and tie it into not self. But I'm so steeped in rave psychology that even that felt like maybe like it really it just I mm, some of it, yeah. I don't like to give a negative review because I think he's doing beautiful things in the world and I think he cares and I think this is heart work for him. I think I've just become a raw person, whether I wanted to or not.
Yeah, I don't think it's negative if you just didn't feel it.
Yeah, I would never not recommend this to someone. I just, if you're deep in mechanics of human design, it's a very hard switch to make.
Point.
I feel like I just kind of looked at it as like self-reflective, like does this resonate? Is this something I see? And kind of it's like some of it resonated, some of it didn't. I don't know that I took anything major away that I've like making changes in the way I look at my chart or anything like that, but
Whereas human design
Yeah.
does do that to me. Like
mhm.
when I really get something from Raw and I'm working with it and I'll bring it to you two and I'm like, I see this and I see this and what's it like for you? Like it's something my desire lock gets turned on. I want to mess with it. I want to change. I like, what's this like? Hugh Jackman said that once, like when you really love something, it isn't like stepped back. It's, you want to argue with it. You want to mess with it. You want to play with it. Like you just want to get your hands in there. And this stuff, no, it reminded me of something I might read and then go meditate, which maybe is his point, but I
Yeah.
don't have an abstract mind. Or
Yeah.
you're knowing, Rebecca, like that, like you're built to let this stuff drop in.
Mm. Well, the way that you just described, wanting to get in there and dig in there, I actually feel that way more about the Pearl sequence, which is the one that goes next after this one. But I'm taking it all in as if, that as though they all go together. And I did have a few ahas. We'll see, when we get to that part, for me. And we do have on our slide here, unlocking your heart. Every relationship brings an opportunity to deepen your relationship to your true purpose. Even if it fell apart, can you reframe it? True purpose is the quality of your consciousness. Look at the city of your purpose. Your relationships are here to exponentially enhance that quality in your life. So that takes what we were talking about just a little bit further, in that it is about us, but then we kind of use the relationship as a way of looking at ourselves and our purpose in life. Here's more from the slides. Principles. Deepest commitment is to own your truth. Take responsibility for your shadow patterns. When relationships end with dharma, there is graciousness on both sides, excluding abuse. True work and deeper purpose of intimacy is to reflect your shadow so you can unlock its gift and transform it. Auras combining equals creative kinetic energy. Awareness cuts through mental judgment, emotional resentment, and chemical overload. Relationships are a mirror of your emotional landscape, as kind of mentioned. Anything here to speak to?
That third one kind of reminded me of struggle as a love gate in human design. Because that's kind of saying that if you aren't grinding away at it, maybe you're not deeply intimate. That excludes the idea of people that maybe have a great deal of companionship or they're just well suited and they have more peace in their relationship. This is kind of saying that that's not true intimacy. If you're not having to transform or you're just beyond your shadow by that point. I don't think every relationship is here to poke at us.
Hmm.
Did you have thoughts about it, Rebecca? What about that third one? Like, do you agree with that?
I can see it. I don't know that I have examples, though. That's one of those ones that does feel kind of big
Hmm.
and little vague. Another quote. You are not being asked to suddenly see your partner as a perfect, sacred vessel of the divine, even though they are. You're being asked to see the way you see your partner as nothing more than your own set of projections.
Hmm.
Ah,
That I agree with.
I think that's a very neat learning perspective. He did mention, which I've heard before in other systems, about how if you do want to do work on your relationship, it doesn't have to be both people.
Mhm.
It could just be yourself working on yourself, and that can completely transform things
Mhm.
because of things like this. So here we have some of these are going to be each of our hologenetic profiles. This is Richard Rudd's way of showcasing each of our individual spheres, he calls them, the keys and the lines that we have individually, just like a human design body graph chart. This is the Gene Keys chart. And everybody has a unique one, and it's based on your birth day and time. And for example, Jen's is here, Kayla's, and myself. And we'll just kind of go through these slightly. So I would encourage you, if you don't have one already, to go get yours at genekeys.com. Very easy, just put in your info and then you'll have your chart. Then you'll see that the green ones on the outside are your activation sequence. It includes your life's work, evolution, radiance, and purpose. And these are the same as your sun and earth in human design, but both the personality and the design. So then the Venus sequence starts with the red at the bottom with your purpose, with your design earth, and then it goes up into the attraction, IQ, EQ, SQ, and then core wound ultimately for the red for the Venus. But then that one also becomes the vocation in the Pearl sequence, and the culture and the Pearl. The life's work also becomes your brand in the Pearl. So some of these have dual names and dual purpose depending on which sequence they're in. And the Venus, the one that we just read, the purpose and the attraction, he, goes through attraction being your design moon, if I remember. And then it talks a little bit about some ways or attraction. And then, so Kayla had line 4 and Jen and I had line 2. And I think we had talked about maybe briefly that we weren't sure how we really felt about that one. And we're not going to go into each one individually, but if I say anything and you want to jump in, just let me know. And with the IQ being intellectual quotient, I remember, EQ being emotional quotient, SQ being spiritual quotient, and then core wound, it starts going backwards from when you're in the womb. So I am seeing it right, core wound, right? That's what he calls it in here.
Yeah.
Or just core sometimes. Okay, so also just called core. The core is when you're in the womb. And then SQ is when you're 0 to 7. Emotional, EQ, 7 to 14. And IQ, 14 to 21. So as I went through these, let's go over to mine. I was trying to think back and remember and get into the feeling of when I was those ages. And what was interesting, 7-year periods, there was a lot of different changes throughout each one. Think of 14 to 21.
Mm-hmm.
I must have gone through like 5 iterations of myself in just that time. And in 7 to 14, maybe not as many, but several different. That's a period where, play on words, where you get your period, where you change as a person, as a human, as a woman. And then just the childhood, I was remembering back to what were my experiences back then. And then I was really trying to contemplate the womb part as to what were my parents up to. Because he did bring that up, like, what is your mom, dad, was their relationship, that kind of thing. My parents were newlyweds when I was in the womb. Well, maybe not completely. I think they waited 6 months or so. But I was imagining that they were still very much in love, but they were also very poor. And so those first few years as well was about survival for them. And so this was one of my ahas that I wanted to share with everyone.
Me too.
My SQ, well, actually on the SQ, line 1 is about certainty, rhythm, and routine. And I highlighted a few things in the book here. It said the first line is always asking these same fundamental questions. Why am I here? And what am I? And then it also says if you have a first line SQ, finding a sense of inner security will be your most fundamental issue in life. This deep genetic need for a sense of security will motivate your entire life. So of those two things, first of all, this one is an aha because I never knew that that's what I was seeking. But once I read it, I felt it very deep. And it's very vulnerable feeling. And the questions though, why am I here? What am I? Absolutely is the fundamental question. And this could be for everyone, but for me, I was like, wow. For some reason, those two sentences in that aspect here of seeking inner security as a fundamental issue of life just really, really hits hard for me. And I don't know what to then like make of that, but just to contemplate it and take it in and then see where that takes me. But that was one of the big ones for me. As I went through, I did also read my gene key for each one of these in the big book, just to help with the contemplation. And each time I read the key again, it helps understand it better. But I do love the 58, as I think, I don't know if we all do, but with vitality being the gift. And I'll take bliss as the city as well. Would you like to ask any questions about these, or would you like to share anything specifically from your gates or lines or keys, I should say? And then we can go over to the other page if that's easier.
I took notes on a few of them where I felt like it either resonated or like totally didn't resonate at all. And in my IQ sphere, okay, the 25.4, it says that you pursue things in a straight line with unwavering focus and dedication. And I feel like that resonated partially because I am very focused for a bit, but then like that third line, cutting things off, kind of happens too. So it's like I can kind of see that, but when he described it in the book, it seemed more long term than I feel like my experience of that is. And then on the EQ sphere, the 16.3, that one, it said the third line has a natural gift for understanding the full emotional spectrum from sadness to joy. This is what makes them masters of sympathy. And I really liked that because I do feel like I'm a sympathetic person. And it also had me thinking about how we learned before that like the first line has, because you go through things so deeply, you can kind of like empathize with others as well who are also going through that. So I saw things that resonated, and then I like could also place them in other places of my chart too.
This does nothing for me. Like aesthetically, I think it's lovely, but I also think really well designed dashboards are lovely for data visualization. There's no, it's not personal. When I look at a human design chart, it's like a sigil and I feel it in my body, whether it's mine or someone else's, because what this seems very siloed. This part here and this part here and this part here, and then there's a connection between them, but what if there's a transit? What if your mom had this one? What if your partner has this? It feels like the way that we're influenced with each other in a living, breathing dynamic is missing here. Like when I look at this, I feel like my brain is engaged, not my body. Whereas when I look at a human design chart, it's like stuff starts turning on and information comes like gut up. Whereas with this, I think I would just analytically approach it. which is its own thing, obviously. But it doesn't
Yeah,
feel alive to me.
and that makes a good point. This doesn't leave any room for like, there's no connection chart
Hmm.
with this, like there would is with human design. It's not our part of the whole, it's just a skeleton of us. So yeah.
Does the sigil of the human design chart affect you versus this? Either of you? I'm just curious. Like, obviously, I don't know if it's a generator thing. I have a sacral response to the human design chart. Does that happen to you at all?
I just feel like it gives so much more room for understanding, like the openness and the hanging gates. And
Hmm.
I definitely feel way different about a human design chart than I do about this. This is like kind of cool to go into different aspects of what these lines and gates mean. But I agree. The human design chart is just different. It kind of like, even not even understanding what a human design chart is, you can look at your chart and see open head Najna and you get it. You start to get what it means without
Yeah.
even understanding. So yeah, I agree.
I love the human design chart, of course, and I definitely resonate with everything you guys have said. However, I also have a connection with this one,
Hmm.
and I feel like it's like an add-on though. It's not a replacement. I would never say like just do this one and not that one. I mean, I would never say that about anything. But for me, it'd be like we have our human design chart and this adds on like an
Hmm.
extra layer of clothing, like the
Hmm.
sweater. That's how I feel about this one. And I like it as a warm sweater. And Jen made us these lovely maps, our love maps. And would you like to tell us about how you laid this out?
So, and I don't remember where it was, but overall, obviously, these are the spheres that you were just talking about. And at some point, he was drawing connections, like when you work between the design earth and the design moon, which would be purpose and attraction, you find dharma. When you look at attraction of the design moon to IQ of the personality of Venus, you find karma. And then intelligence and emotions is a pathway to intelligence, emotion to spirituality is a pathway to love, and spirituality to vocation, or that sacred wound, is a pathway to realization. That I appreciated. I thought, okay, I have a little bit more of a sense of, this is just how my brain works. I had more of a sense of what to do with it. Plus, I was having fun with the colors. But what I found, what kind of took me out, that made me think, why these? Like, why are we moving between a design moon and a P Venus and a P Mars and a D Venus? Like, this feels random to me. I'm sure there's a purpose somewhere, but at least or it hasn't been explained, because at least in human design, I get why each planet is assigned to each one. So I found part of what felt distracting to me was why are the Venuses intelligence and spirituality, but not attraction? Like, they function so differently here than they do in human design. No, this was just a way to lay it out so my brain could organize it, because looking at the balls, I just wait for them to start bouncing. Whereas at least here, it feels like, okay, this is more modular. I can get a sense of it.
A great way
Mhm.
to look at it. I love the way the charts look, and you've kind of got, purpose. Oh yeah, that's what this is in human design. That's what mine is. And here's like a really nice overview of it. You did a good job.
One
You
of
always make it pretty.
the, well, I also wanted, like, for people that are really into this, like I said, I don't want to discount. He designed a beautiful system. It's just not my go-to. But for someone else who really wants to work with this, like, you could take this grid as an idea. I could see someone making one for themselves and printing them out, and maybe that's the year they spend working with the love book or the pearl
Mm.
or whatever. It's just that way you're not having to constantly flip it. And I could flip through the big book. I saw the pattern of this more easily.
I do agree. This is a very pretty layout. And I love how it just lays it all out as far as which planets are being associated with each sphere and lays out our shadows, gifts, and cities. I think I mentioned one of my favorite gifts that I have in this section is the vitality. One of the most challenging for me is the vocation and core wound, gift being sensitivity, city being sacrifice, with the shadow of codependence. And I did read this one over again in the Gene Keys book just to get a better grasp. But each time I get a better grasp, and I'm getting more and more understanding of the shadow of codependence, the way that Richard Rudd describes it. It is about our dependence on anything outside of ourselves.
Mm.
And that even to the level of food.
Mm.
So any type of dependence that we as humans are attaching ourselves to, that is the shadow. Therefore, the gift springs from independence. So it's funny because sometimes he uses the word like opposite of the shadow, but it's not the gift, but that's how you get to the gift. So he describes independence as the way to the gift, becoming less and less dependent on anything outside of yourself for your life, for your future, for your health and well-being, for a relationship, for prosperity, which is lovely because then that comes back to the whole idea that we are the consciousness that we all share. We're just experiencing this human life. And just to kind of remember that. But then it goes into sensitivity when you're being open to others, to helping others, to being in relationship with others, not in a dependent way, in an open way. So it's funny because the words trigger me, but then the actual description of it, when I get down deep and contemplate it, I find it really beautiful and helpful, especially because this one also goes into my vocation, which I love to contemplate and learn more about. Were there any other specific shadows, gifts, or cities of each of yours that you would like to share?
I don't get lust, passion on attraction,
Mm-hmm.
not as a second line concept. I mean, even as a bonding strategy in the sexual analysis, you're kind of looking at shyness or boldness. But it doesn't mean you're really shy. It's more that sense of who's bold enough to break through, and then they'll find out, oh, wow, maybe you're not that shy all the time. It doesn't mean you have to be a wallflower. But some of these kind of make sense, like a fifth line as a leader or a victim, a fifth line, practical, defensive, self-esteem, belonging. That like some of these just kind of resonate with overall I Ching hexagram lines. But the less passion, I'm like, I don't get that at all.
I felt the same way.
Yeah.
I did have one final, I believe this is my final uh, part about the book that I did really like. Well, they go together, it's two things. But one of them was about his idea of having courtesy
Mm.
for the people in your life. And it is a good reminder that sometimes when you're living closely with people, that you don't treat them with respect that would normally be the type of respect that is valuable. um, or that, the way that you would want to be treated, for example. So it was just a good reminder that he just really kind of threw in a practical tip in the midst of all the spiritual woo woo to sometimes just have some courtesy with the people in your life. That can go a long way. And along the same point, he talked about this keeping it in the porch metaphor. But I found fascinating. I'd be curious if you guys agree or disagree. He's like, sometimes you just should not be telling your partner or your people that you're close to all of your emotions and drama that are going on inside your head right away. Sit on it for a little bit, keep it in the porch, let it like kind of dissolve and work itself through maybe it's kind of like let an emotional wave go through a
Mhm.
little. And then after all of that, if it feels appropriate to share and come, and it's a welcoming environment, then maybe that's the time to share. But this idea that anything can just be said and shared and spewed as an emotion to anyone, he mentions here that that's not going to be useful. And I really agreed with that. And that would be something, another practical, useful tip that I would use in my own life and use with others that I'm helping with this knowledge. Did either of those pieces, did you have any thoughts or feelings about those?
I
I would
agree
say,
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, especially that second part about the emotions, and especially if you have an emotional wave, there's that quote that says like never go to bed mad. Well, if you have an emotional wave, go to bed mad, because the next day you're probably not going to be mad about it anymore and you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble. So I like it.
And it
Absolutely.
reminds me too of follow your type strategy and authority for a
Mm.
reason. Like just because you're going through an internal state doesn't mean it's appropriate to share it. And because I found there are times where there was someone I really wanted to tell something to, and it felt like this pregnant pause of just it, and it never felt right. And I thought that's better because a couple years ago I would have just blurted out with it and it wasn't right. But I could feel that sense of it's just not the right time. And my mind wants to say it. So I think there's that kind of wisdom too, as you know yourself better, you start to get a better sense of timing. But I agree, not just because you have a thought doesn't mean it needs to be expressed.
Hmm.
And there was one part on mine that I liked a lot on the 45 where it talked about community basically or belonging. And it was something about how that fourth line is looking to find belonging through community. And I thought that is true. I find myself doing that quite a bit. That part rang true to me.
Nice.
Yeah.
Any other final thoughts that you haven't been able to share yet?
So I hope people find what they need from it.
Yeah. Were there any other questions about it that you were thinking were burning to be answered?
Mm. More like I would just like to watch you teach a course on it. I don't know that I want to read
Okay.
the book 4 times enough to do it myself, but I
Hmm.
enjoy. I think you have more patience for this, and I can just tell that with such a logical mind, it's very hard for me to try to wrangle both of those at the same time.
Yay. Yes, I'll take that as a future invitation
Mhm.
and I will go down that path. Well, thanks for joining. You had any questions or comments to add? We'd love to hear from you and see you next time.